shares can be sold at the nominal value, or it can be sold at a premium, or it can be sold at a discount. There are only two types of shares, that is equity shares and preference shares. The funds can be raised through equity issue without creating any charge on the assets of the company. Equity shareholders are considered as the owners of the company, but preference shareholders are not considered as owners. Hello everyone, I am Purnima, faculty in the Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. In this session, that is Chapter 8, Session 3, we will be having a discussion on the next source of finance, that is the issue of shares. Let us see what do we mean by the issue of shares. So as you all know, there are various forms of business organizations, and business organization which needs a small amount of finance can be started by a sole trader, whereas if the business organization needs some more funds, then we can start a partnership concern. But then if a business organization requires a very huge amount of funds running into crores of money, then we need to start a joint stock company. So as the name itself suggests, a joint stock company wherein the share capital is divided into number of shares which are being subscribed by the public. Or in other words, a joint stock company can be formed through the issue of shares to the public, and the money collected from the public can be taken as the share capital of the company. So through the issue of shares, so by having a share capital wherein the capital of the company will be divided into a number of shares, and then each share will be sold to the public, and once the public sends the money, then that money will be retained as the share capital of the company, and that money will be utilized for running the business. So suppose the company needs money worth rupees 10 lakhs. Then what can the company do? The company can just divide this 10 lakhs into shares of 100 rupees each, and then it will sell it in the open market where the shares will be purchased by the public, and then it will just collect the 10 lakhs of rupees, and that 10 lakhs will be considered as the share capital of the company. Now, in the previous session of the formation of the company, I had already explained to you what is the procedure for the formation of the company. Now, here we know how the shares are to be issued and what is the procedure for issue of shares. So, all this we have already discussed in our previous chapter. Now, let us concentrate on the issue of shares. So, we all know that the share capital comprises of a number of shares. So, it is divided into a number of shares which will be purchased by the public, and that money which is collected from the public, that will be called as the share capital. Now, let us look into what is in the first slide. Now, the issue of shares, the capital obtained by the issue of shares is known as the share capital. So, whatever the money we are collecting from the issue of shares, or in other words, we can always call it as the sale of shares. So, through the sale of shares, whatever money you are collecting, that is what we call as issue of shares, and that money which is collected, that is called as the share capital. The capital of a company is divided into small units called shares. So it is divided into small units called shares, and each share has its nominal value. Now, what do we mean by the nominal value? Suppose we have a company which wants a share capital of 10 lakhs. So it wants to have a share capital of 10 lakhs. Now what can it do? It can issue 1 lakh shares of rupees 10 each. So 1 lakh into 10 comes up to 10 lakhs. Now this 10 rupees what you are issuing, so this is the nominal value. So this is the nominal value, or it is also called as the face value of the share. So the nominal value or the face value is the value at which the share is valued. So it is the value for which the share will be sold in the market. So this is called as the nominal value, that is the face value. So whatever is the value decided by the promoters of the company, so that will be called as the nominal value or the face value of the shares. Now the shares can be sold at at the nominal value, or it can be sold at a premium, or it can be sold at a discount. Now, what do we mean by issue at premium? Suppose I tell you that the shares are issued at a premium. Suppose I tell that 10 rupee shares are issued at a premium of 2 rupees. Now what does that mean? So the 10 rupee share is being sold at plus 2, that is 12 rupees per share. So we should understand that when the shares are sold at a higher value than the nominal value, then it is called as issue of shares at a premium. Now, suppose this 10 rupees share is issued at rupees 9, that is below the face value, that we call it as the issue of shares at a discount. So we should understand that shares can be issued at par, issued at premium, issued at discount. So if the share value, the issue price is more than the nominal value, we call it as issue of shares at a premium. If the issue price is lower than the face value, we call it as issue of shares at a discount. And if the shares are issued at the nominal value, we call it as issue of shares at par. So this we should understand. Now let us look into what are the different types of shares. Now there are two types of shares normally issued by a company. These are equity shares and preference shares. So usually there are only two types of shares, that is equity shares and preference shares. The money raised by the issue of equity shares is called as equity share capital, where the money raised by the issue of preference shares is called as preference share capital. So whatever money you raise through the issue by selling the equity shares, we call it as equity capital, and the money raised by the issue of preference shares, we call it as preference capital. Now let us have a look into what is the meaning of the word equity shares. So equity shares is the most important source of raising long-term capital by a company. Equity shares represents the ownership of a company, and thus the capital raised by the issue of these shares is known as the ownership capital or the owner's funds. Now, what do we mean by equity shares? So, equity shareholders are considered as the owners of the company. Now, why do we call them as the owners of the company? Because they are the major decision-making power of the company. So, these equity shareholders, so whoever are there, they have to attend the annual general body meeting and they have to take part in the decision-making of the company. And as such, equity shareholders are considered as the owners of the company. Now, why they are considered as owners? So, equity share is the most important source of raising long-term capital. So, why we call it as the long-term capital? Because equity shares cannot be redeemed within the lifespan of the company. And as such, the equity shareholders will get back the money only after the paying all the creditors and the preference shares, and lastly, if there is any money left, only then it will be paid to the equity shareholders. And moreover, these equity shareholders, they will be bearing all the losses of the company. So if the company is running in losses, then they will have to bear the losses. If the company is running in profits, they can enjoy the profits of the company. And as such, they take part in all the decision making of the company. And as such, we call them as the owner's equity or the owner's funds. So the equity shares represents the ownership of the company, and thus capital raised is known as the ownership capital or the owner's funds. Now, one more important thing is the equity share capital, whatever is collected, they will be used for purchasing of the long-term assets of the company. So, it may be the fixed assets. As such, it will be purchased through this equity share capital because they will be there in the company until the company exists. And once the company goes into liquidation, then only the equity shareholders will get back their capital. Then, equity share capital is a prerequisite to the creation of a company. Equity shareholders do not get fixed dividend but are paid on the basis of the earnings by the company. They are referred to as residual owners since they receive what is left after all other claims on the company's income and assets have been settled. They enjoy the reward as well as bear the risk of ownership. Now, there are certain features of the equity share capital. Now, what are the features here? So, equity share capital is a prerequisite for the creation of a company. So, until and unless you issue shares, you cannot form a joint stock company, and as such, equity share capital is a prerequisite. It is a necessity to start a company. Then, equity shareholders do not get any fixed dividend on their capital. That is, if the company is in loss, then they will not get any dividend. But if the company is having profit, only then they will be giving the dividend. Then they are referred to as the residual owners. Why do we refer them as the residual owners? Since they receive what is left after all other claims of the company's income and assets have been settled. So when the company goes into liquidation, the accounts of the creditors and all other external creditors will be settled first, and later on the preference shareholders' money will be returned, and if anything is left after returning that, only then these equity shareholders will get back their investment, and hence we call them as the residual owners. So they enjoy the reward as well as they bear the risk of ownership. So when the company earns more profits, they will be earning more returns on their investment, and when the company is running into losses, they will be bearing the losses, and that is why we call them as the owners funds or owners equity. Now let us have a look into what are the merits of equity shares. So equity shares are suitable for investors who are willing to assume risk for higher returns. Those investors who are very good in investing, they know how to select the company, what is the best investment. For those investors, it is a very good kind of investment. So if you are well versed in investing, if you can assess what is the performance of the company in the next year, then it is good for those investors to invest in equity shares, because they will have a higher returns on their investment, and they will also know what is the actual amount of risk involved, so they can easily invest in equity shares, so and then they can enjoy higher profits. Then next one is payment of dividend to equity shareholders is not compulsory. Therefore, there is no burden on the company in this respect. So as I had explained earlier, the payment of dividends for these equity shareholders is not compulsory. So the company may declare the dividend or it may not declare the dividend, and hence so there is no burden on the company as such. It can just collect the money and it can just run the business without having any obligation to pay dividends to the equity shareholders. Then the next merit is equity capital serves as a permanent capital, as it is to be repaid only at the time of liquidation of a company. So we call equity capital as a long-term capital. So why do we call it as a long-term capital? Because the company it can be redeemed only when the company goes into liquidation. So as long as the company is in existence, the equity share capital will remain in the company, and it will be repaid only at the time of liquidation of the company. As it stands last in the list of the claims, it provides a cushion for creditors in the event of winding up of a company. So what do we mean by winding up of a company? In other words, it means the closure of a company. So when there is a closure of the company, the equity shareholders will be last in the list for repayment. So the creditors and all other external persons who have lent to the company, they will be assured of their funds because of the equity shareholders. Then the next merit of equity share capital is equity capital provides credit worthiness to the company and confidence to prospective loan providers. So if there are any loan providers or if there is any talk of financing the business, so first thing they will look into is what is the equity share capital of the company. If the company has a sizable proportion of equity share capital, capital, then it enhances the credit worthiness of the company, and such companies can borrow easily from other institutions, and as such it will be an attractive prospect for the creditors and other persons who want to finance the company. Then the funds can be raised through equity issue without creating any charge on the assets of the company. The assets of the company are therefore free to be mortgaged for the purpose of borrowings if the need be. So the funds can be raised through equity issue without creating any charge on the assets of the company. Now, what do we mean by charge on the asset? So, for example, if you want to have a bank loan, then you should have an asset. So, what is the asset? It can be anything. It can be a land and building or a plant and machinery or your shares and securities, anything like that. So, whatever asset you are having, so it will be pledged to the bank, and then the bank will give the loan to us. So this pledging of the asset will create a charge by the banker on the asset. So the banker will have the first right on that asset. So, or we cannot sell the asset without the paying the banker. So this is known as creating a charge on the asset. Now, so when we are raising funds through the equity shares, there is no charge created on any assets of the company. So the assets are free, and without having any charge on the asset, we can just collect the money from the shareholders. This is first thing. Second thing is the payment of dividend is not compulsory, and hence the company will get free money to invest as it needs. So this is one of the merits of the equity shares. Next merit of equity shares is democratic control over management of the company is assured due to voting rights of equity shareholders. So there is democratic control. So there will be lakhs of equity shareholders who would have invested in the company, and they will be attending the annual general body meetings of the company, and they will be electing the board of directors of the company, and as such the company will be run on a democratic manner, because the majority decision, whatever they take, that will be final, and as such the company will be run on democratic manner. Limitations of equity shares. So investors who want steady income may not prefer equity shares, as equity shares get fluctuating returns. So this is one of the limitations of equity shares. Now what does this say? Fluctuating returns. So why they get fluctuating returns? Because equity shareholders are not entitled to any fixed rate of dividend. So when the company makes huge profits, they will get huge returns on their investment. When the company is running in loss, they don't get any returns. And even when the company makes huge profits, if the board of directors decide to just have a portion of the profit as retained earnings, then only they will get a small portion of the profit as dividend, and as such whatever dividend they are receiving, that will be fluctuating year after year. So they don't get the same return on their investment, and as such this is one of the limitations of equity shares. Then the second limitation is the cost of equity shares is generally more as compared to the cost of raising funds through other sources. So the cost of equity shares is generally more as compared to the cost of raising funds through other sources. What does this mean? So whenever we have to issue equity shares to the public, there is a lot of procedure involved. So the company has to issue a prospectus, and then they have to also undergo the flotation cost. Now what is this flotation cost? So flotation cost involves you have to have lot of advertisement for that, then you have to appoint the merchant bankers, then you will have to appoint the underwriters. So all this involves lot of money, and as such it is one of the costliest way of raising the funds for the company. Then the next limitation is the issue of additional equity shares dilute the voting power and earnings of the existing equity shareholders. So whenever the company wants to raise money through the equity shares, so what will happen is the number of equity shares shareholders will be more, and as such the control of the company will get diluted. So if there were 1 lakh existing equity shareholders and the company is already again introducing 1 lakh shares, it is issuing to the public, then what will happen is the existing equity shareholders, they will lose the control over the company, as all the equity shareholders have voting power, and as such they will not have control over the company. Then the next limitation of equity share is more formalities, procedural delays are involved while raising funds through equity shares. So there is more formalities here. If we want to issue shares through the equity, then it is very, very procedural. That is, lot of procedures have to be followed and lot of delays are involved. So what are the delays? So what is the correct time to go for the public offer? So all these things we have to calculate, and only then we can issue the equity shares, and as such it is a very cumbersome task, and the calculation of the right time to enter the stock market, so that is also very, very cumbersome. Then next type of shares we will be discussing is the preference shares. Now what are these preference shares? Preference shares, the capital raised by the issue of preference shares is called as preference share capital. The preference shareholders enjoy a preferential position over equity shareholders in two ways. Now, we know that the company shares of the company are divided into equity shares and preference shares, but equity shareholders are considered as the owners of the company, but preference shareholders are not considered as owners, but they have preference over the equity shares. So whatever money we collect by the sale of preference shares, we call it as the preference share capital. But then why do we call them as preference share capital? Because they have preference with regard to two aspects. Now what are the two aspects? The first one is receiving a fixed rate of dividend out of the net profits of the company before any dividend is declared for equity shareholders. So whenever the company is making profits, then first thing will be you will have to pay to the preference shareholders, and then these preference shareholders are entitled to a fixed percentage of profit. Suppose they tell issue of 12% preference shares. Now what does the 12% represent? So it represents the rate of dividend to be given to the preference shareholders. Now this 12% will be the constant every time. So whenever the company makes profits, the shareholders is entitled to 12% of the profits. So they will be having a fixed rate of dividend as such. So this is one preference they will be having, which the equity shareholders do not have. Then the next preference is receiving their capital after the claims of the company's creditors have been settled at the time of liquidation. So at the time of liquidation, or when the company goes into liquidation, or when it is the company is closing, then what will happen is the assets of the company will be sold and the creditors of the company will be settled. So once the creditors are settled, the next comes the preference shareholders. So we will have to pay them first, and after that if there is any money left only, then only the equity shares can be paid, and that is why we call them as preference shareholders. Why? Because they have a preference with respect to fixed rate of dividend, and they have a preference with respect to the return of the capital. Then let us look into the other aspects of the preference shares. So the preference shares resemble the debentures as they bear fixed rate of return. Also, the dividend is payable only at the discretion of the directors and only out of the profit of after tax. To that extent, these resemble equity shares. Now, we have a resemblance of preference shares and debentures. Now, debentures are, in other words, they are considered as the loan capital of the company. So, if you purchase a debenture, your money will be taken as a loan by the company. But if you are purchasing an equity equity share or a preference share, it will be considered as a capital to the company. Now, these debentures have a fixed rate of interest. So, the company will be giving a fixed rate of interest for these debenture holders. The same way, the preference shareholders will also be getting a fixed percentage of dividend on their investment. So, in this way, they resemble the debentures to some extent, but then debenture holders will be paid in the form of interest, whereas preference shareholders will be paid in the form of a dividend. Then next is dividend, whatever is to be declared to the preference shareholders, it is at the discretion of the directors. If the directors decide that the entire profit is to be retained in the company, then these preference shareholders will not get any dividend on the shares. So, this is one thing which has to be taken care of. Then next, let us go into the merits of preference shares. Now, what are the merits here? The preference shares provide reasonably steady income in the form of fixed rate of return and safety of investment. Suppose you are a first time investor and you want to invest in the shares of a company, then one of the safest investment is to go in for preference shares. So, if you are investing in the preference shares of a company, you can be assured that you will get a fixed rate of dividend on your shares, and secondly, you will also be having the safety of your investment. So, your investment will be safe. So, once all the creditors are settled, the company will settle the preference shareholders first and then only the equity shareholders. So, if you are looking in terms of safety of investment and a return of investment, then preference shareholders shares they are the safest kind of investment for first time investors. Then preference shares are useful for those investors who want fixed rate of return with comparatively low risk. So, those investors who don't want to take any risk but they want to have a return, for them these preference shares are tailor-made. Then the next one is, it does not affect the control of the equity shareholders over the management, as preference shareholders don't have voting rights. Now, as we have seen in the case of equity shares, the voting rights will be distributed among the large number of shareholders. So, as and when you issue more and more equity shares, the voting rights will be distributed among all of them. But in case of preference shares, no matter how many preference shares you issue to the public, the control of the company cannot be diluted, because the preference shares holders, they don't have any voting rights. So, they cannot take part in the decision making of the company, and as such, the control of the company will be with the equity shareholders only. Then, the payment of fixed rate of dividend to the preference shareholders may enable a company to declare higher rates of dividend for the equity shareholders in good times. So, whenever a company declares a dividend on its shares, so it will be a plus point for the company. So, people will understand that whenever a company is declaring dividend, it means that the company is running into huge profits and it wants to share its profits among its preference shareholders and equity shareholders. So, this is one of the merits for the preference shareholders. So, whenever there is a declaration of dividend for the preference shareholders, it means that the equity shareholders will also get dividend. Then the next merit is, the preference shareholders have a preferential right of repayment over equity shareholders in the event of liquidation of a company. So, this is a repetition of what I have been telling you. So, this is one preferential treatment the preference shareholders will be getting when the company goes into liquidation. So, they have a preferential right to get back their investment over the equity shareholders. Then next one is, preference capital does not create any sort of charge against the assets of a company. So whenever the company is raising money through the preference shares, so it does not create a charge on the asset. But whereas if it is raising funds through the issue of debentures, then it will be creating a charge on the assets of the company. But then whenever you are issuing preference shares, it does not create any charge on the assets of the company. Now, what are the limitations of preference shares? So preference shares are not suitable for those investors who are willing to take risk and are interested in higher returns. So the persons who want to have higher returns and they want to enjoy higher profits, for them these preference shares are not attractive. Why? Because they will be giving only a fixed rate of dividend, which is they don't like. So this is one of the limitation of preference shares. Then the next limitation is preference capital dilutes the claims of equity shareholders over the assets of the company. So then this preference capital, it dilutes the claims of equity shareholders over the assets of the company. So it means that whenever you have an equity share capital, so you will be having a sizable portion of the fixed assets of the company through this equity capital, whereas preference capital dilutes the claims of the equity shareholders. So whatever the equity shareholders cannot have a claim over the assets, because the preference shareholders will have to be paid before these equity shareholders are to be paid. Then the rate of dividend on preference shares is generally higher than the rate of interest on the debentures. So as we all know that the company will be paying interest to the debenture holders, and this percentage of interest will be lower than the rate of dividend which is given to the preference shares. So this is one of the limitations. Then the next limitation is, as the dividend of these on these shares is to be paid only when the company earns profit, there is no assured return for the investors. So these shares may not be very attractive to the investors. So this kind of profit will be declared on these preference shares only when the company earns profits. But if the company does not earn profits, then that whatever the dividend they have to declare, they will not declare, and as such the shareholders will not get any return on their investment. The dividend paid is not deductible from profits as expense. Thus there is no tax saving as in the case of interest on loans. So whenever we are paying debenture interest to the debenture holders, so that interest is deductible as an expense in the profit and loss account of the company. But then whenever we are paying dividend to the preference shareholders, it is not a deductible expense and it does not create any savings of tax to the company. With this, we come to the end of this session 3 on sources of business finance. Hope you have all understood this. Thank you.